This is a story from Tara, and I think this is a pretty cool story. Recently, after listening to one of your older stories from a woman named Trish in the Caribbean about the horses galloping that shook the house, I was reminded of some things that happened at my best friend's home when we were kids. It began when we were 9 and it kept on until we were 13. We live in the town of Hastings in the southeast of England by the sea. It's known as 1066 country due to the Battle of Hastings fought in 1066. My best friend had just moved there from London with her mum. People from the UK, we call them mom, M-O-M, and they use the word mum, and I stumble on that sometimes, so I'm sorry. Back to the story. They had taken over a restaurant near my house and were living upstairs above the restaurant. We met at the beach during the summer on school holidays, and that's where most of the locals spent the holidays back in the 1970s. It was cheap and it was easy and relaxing and sociable. At my friend's insistence, we became best friends. She was an only child whose parents were breaking up. Well, I came from a family of 5. My dad was chronically ill with PTSD, bipolar disorder, and lung cancer. He was in the SAS during World War II, and he suffered for years after. It must have been very hard on my mom. She was beautiful and quiet, but she was strong. I began to spend much of my spare time at my best friend's home upstairs from the restaurant, while her lovely mom, who was like a second mom to me, worked hard downstairs in the popular restaurant. We often heard strange noises like crashing bottles in the wine cellar, but when we went to look, none of them would be broken. Sometimes we heard wardrobe doors being banged repeatedly. Then they would stop when we crept up to the stairs to have a look. There were strangely creaking floorboards and there were strong smells. Once when I stayed the night, I got up the next morning by myself to watch Sesame Street. And as I sat there watching television, something unseen walked across the living room and it sat down next to me on the leather Chesterfield sofa. When you sit on those sofas, they let out air. I counted 1, 2, 3 in my head, and then I ran back to the bedroom to my friend. She was walking out of the room as I arrived, and I nearly jumped out of my skin when we almost collided. The next incident I remember happened when we were 10. It's the memory that stands out the most for me. It was probably a Sunday evening because the restaurant was closed and we were left alone in the building with her dog and puppy. Her mom had gone out for the evening. It was summer, so it was still light outside. We were watching the Killer Bees movie. Horror movies are our favorites, and we knew the entire script of An American Werewolf in London word for word, so this movie was tame for us. We were sitting opposite each other, glued to the TV with the dog sleeping next to us, when the heaviest footsteps I've ever heard stomped across the room above us. It was her mom's bedroom. They marched from one end of the room to the other and then stopped at the landing, slowly and deliberately, like an elephant. The whole room was shaking. The lampshades shuddered on the lamps, and the hangings on the walls quaked and threatened to fall. The building is a listed one with the original wood beams across the ceiling. It was a solid structure. Well, we froze and stared at each other without saying a word. The dogs started going nuts and they were barking hysterically and staring at the stairs up to the next floor. The older dog was a border collie who was unpredictable and had been trained to attack if you said, "Go get him, Gil." He would sometimes chase us and growl, which always made me a little nervous of him. So I jumped up and I ran over to my friend's chair. We sat there clasping onto each other, terrified and unsure of what to do. We shouted out loud a few times, "Get away from us!" Then we took Gil to the stairs and we said, "Go get him, Gil!" Well, he carried on barking with his fur standing on end, but he refused to go upstairs. We didn't think to call the police. Instinctively, we knew it was a ghost that always made the weird sounds. Only it had never been this loud or menacing before. The room stopped shaking and there was no more noise, and we waited in fear for something to come down the stairs, but it never did. We decided to put the dogs downstairs in the restaurant, lock up, and run the 5 minutes up to my house. Later, we got a call from my friend's mom looking for us, and we told her what happened. It was probably a seagull that got through my bedroom window, she said, laughing it off. Yeah, Mom, a seagull with the biggest boots on ever, my friend retorted. As kids go, we quickly got on with it, and we chalked it up to another incident. But even now, recalling it gives me the chills. By the way, there was no way to get into that apartment except by walking past us into the living room. And the way those footsteps sounded, slow, deliberate, stomping, and so loud, they were inhuman. We tried several times to recreate the effect. First, she would walk around upstairs with me down, and then vice versa, and we were never able to do it. I'm not sure a grown man could have copied that sound. As the months went on, other noises and strange events happened. One evening, my friend went down to the kitchen alone to get some food. As she stood in front of the refrigerator, a window unlocked itself and started banging. When she turned around, she saw a see-through man. She collapsed onto the floor and covered her face. Once it all stopped, she ran upstairs without her food. Local legend has it that many years ago, a local fisherman had fallen down the cellar stairs and died. He was supposedly buried there. My friend's mom sold the restaurant a few years later and moved down the road to another old house. Nothing ever happened there. The new owners of the restaurant, who I worked for many years later, said they never experienced anything. My friend's mom, however, admitted to us when we were older that she knew things were happening there. She would wake up at 3 a.m. every night knowing that something was watching her, but she said she never felt scared. I have read that poltergeists can activate around angry teenagers. My friend, who is still my best friend now, we were in our 50s, she was a very angry, emotional kid who had many outbursts of anger. She would also sleepwalk most nights. We've remained friends because she is also a lovely person and the kindest, most loyal, supportive friend ever. Her and I are soulmates, and this is our story. Well, thank you, ma'am. This was, I don't know if I think I did say the woman's name. She never said whether I could use it or not, but her name is Tara, and I think this is an email I've had for a long time because she refers back to a video in the Caribbean about horses, ghost horses galloping down streets in the Caribbean, and I think I did that 2 years ago. So I hope Tara's still listening and knows that her story finally made it on the podcast. I love this story. These ghost stories fascinate me, and I thought this was a good one. So I hope you all enjoyed it too. Hey, welcome to the Dixie Cryptid YouTube podcast, also the What If It's True podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, iHeart, Amazon Music, Audible. You can listen to this podcast anywhere. If you'll search for What If It's True podcast on your podcast app, and you will use about 10% of your data and battery listening through a podcast app than you will on YouTube. But if you listen on YouTube, I'm glad you're here. I just want you to have that option. Hey, I've got 4 stories in this podcast. That's really all I've got to say, other than Happy New Year to everyone. I'm recording this on December 30. We're about to jump into 2023, and it should be a great year. I'm looking forward to it, and I hope your year is perfect. I wish that for everybody that's listening. But enough of that. Let's jump into these stories. All right, here we go. All right, the person who wrote this email wishes to be anonymous, but here's what she writes. Since I moved here over 10 years ago, my stepfather has warned me about the man next door. He said to never trust him and that he had bad blood. That was my stepfather's way of saying he was a little bit off, and my stepfather was right. Over the years, he's tried to burn me out, he's taken me to court, and even fired a gun at my son. He's clearly not a good neighbor. He's taken others to court on this road as well, and nobody likes him. At the beginning of last summer, I dreamt that I was on my back porch when a female Bigfoot came around my mobile home toward me. I stood on the porch and told her that I was sorry that people were shooting at them. She was mad that people were doing that and started toward the back porch, so I ran inside. I heard her come up on the back porch and I looked out the window at her, and then I woke up. It was a strange dream, but I chalked it up to listening to many Bigfoot stories. Sometime after that, I noticed a chair at the back of my yard sitting inside the wood line. I thought, who the heck is in the woods looking at my place? Later, I noticed that someone was in the woods with a flashlight shining it into my window. I knew immediately that it was my crazy neighbor. It had to be. This is a rural area populated by mostly older people. No one else would be out here walking around in the woods at night. This man had taken to peeking into windows, and that didn't sit well with me at all. It wasn't just my windows. He was looking into my next-door neighbor's windows as well. She is a single mom with teenage daughters. Well, I called the law on that pervert, but the police wouldn't even make a report. He caused a stink with the sheriff's office and the governor's office, and now they wouldn't even go talk to him. Because the law wouldn't touch him, it was like he ruled the road. And then one day he saw two dogs running down the road. They were someone's pets that had got loose. They weren't on his property, but he shot them anyway. It weren't kill shots, mind you. He shot them so that they would lay there screaming, and they cried for 20 minutes before they died. Well, that was the final straw. I was sick to my stomach and desperate. Those dogs were laying out there on the road in agony, and I was afraid if I went out to help them, he'd shoot me too. So I did the one thing I could do. I looked up at the sky and I said, Father, if only you would send Bigfoot over there to show this nut who the real king of the woods is. This man had clearly become a threat to anyone and anything around him. That night, I dreamed of a male Bigfoot covered in black fur with a cone-shaped head, and he was headed our way. I woke up wondering if this Bigfoot had picked up on my plea and was coming to help with this evil little man. The next day, that man was cutting down a tree, and it fell on his house, taking 2 more trees down with it for a total of 3 trees on his house. I guess God took care of him. Later, the neighbor across the street had a sighting where something came out of the woods and took a small puppy out of their yard and ran off with it. They called the sheriff and they said there'd been sightings around the area, but they didn't find anything. Unfortunately, the neighbors have seen something and taken a few shots at it. Now the big fella had an attitude. Not long after that, my son came running inside one night telling me that there was something big out in the woods moving around, and it was snapping branches and growling at everything that moved. He grabbed a shotgun and ran back out before I could stop him, and I followed him outside screaming that I knew it was Mac Daddy Bigfoot and to leave him alone. He's our neighbor too, I said. Let him be. Don't shoot him. And then I explained that I had called him in on our crazy neighbor. Well, that got a strange look from my son. He's been cutting his mother a wide path ever since. I know how I sounded, but the neighborhood has been pretty quiet ever since. The crazy neighbor has stopped wandering around at night looking into women's windows, but he's built an 8-foot fence around his yard. My Bigfoot friend is still out there. I've smelled him a few times. Well, I wish him peace, and I hope he doesn't harm any kitties. They're my pets. I've never seen him. I don't go looking for him, nor do I feed him. I have a few fruit trees in my yard that he can help himself to if he wants to, but that's on him, not me. I don't fear him either, or his mate. I think they see people for what's inside, whether it's good or evil. And who am I to say what the Father chooses to place on this earth? I had one last dream about Mac Daddy Bigfoot. He was way up in a tree and his eyes were glowing white. And I thanked him for showing up and showing out. And as I did so, his eyes glowed even brighter and whiter. And then I woke up. A few weeks ago, I was sitting out in the yard one afternoon and I heard what sounded like a 500-pound owl. And I thought to myself, who you trying to fool, Mac Daddy Bigfoot? That owl sounded awful. It was way too deep. You need to work on that, buddy. I may never know for sure if the crazy neighbor ever got a look at Mac Daddy, but I do know that he's been pretty good at keeping to himself and on his side of his fence, and he isn't playing Peeping Tom anymore either. That's the end of this email. I don't even know what to think about that. I don't think this woman ever even saw the Bigfoot, so how do you know it's a Bigfoot? You prayed to God and you think God brought the Bigfoot to... Now look, I'm not arguing that this man isn't a creep. Good grief, who would want to live in a neighborhood with someone like that? And you know there are people like that. They're just mean, weird, evil people. They never change. They're always that way. I've met probably a half a dozen of those people in my life. I'd like to tell you a story about a couple of them, but maybe I will sometime. They usually get what's coming to them sometimes, or at least I've seen that happen a couple of times. But I don't know what to make of this story. It's not really an encounter story. It's not really I don't know. She said she smelled him a couple of times. Anyway, I'm not sure what to make of it. But even so, I thought it was good enough to put on the podcast because it's quite interesting. Some people say, Bigfoot people are way out there. Matter of fact, I was talking to an author not too long ago, and he said, man, Bigfoot people are way out there. And I'm like, yeah, some of them are. They really are. I'm not saying this lady is, but it's a crazy story. Even so, I really enjoyed reading it, and I hope you did too. Here is a story I got back to read for Halloween back in October. Obviously, I didn't read it for Halloween because I just came across it in my inbox. That's kind of the way it goes. There are a lot of emails in there, and I just kind of comb through them when I need stories to do. And I ran across this one, and so it won't be a Halloween story. It'll be a New Year's Eve story or something. I don't know, but it's pretty good. It's a really good story, and the man claims it's true. So let's hear what he has to say. One day soon after I had graduated from high school, a friend of mine and I, his name is Dwayne, we've been buddies since intermediate school, had just seen a movie in Waikiki and we were coming back. We had caught a bus that dropped us off in the back of McKinley High School. It was 9 p.m. or so when we started walking through the back of McKinley High School on the field there. At that time, they didn't have a fence around their track. We wanted to get Burger King. It was a little dark and halfway through the field as we cut through the school. At that point, I felt something funny. I wasn't quite sure what was wrong, but I kept looking behind me. Dwayne asked me, "What's the matter, Danny?" And I told him, "I don't know, but something's wrong. I can feel it. It's like something's about to happen." Dwayne told me to stop it. He said I was making him nervous. And then we got to the courtyard in front of the high school, and we saw hundreds of large black moths flying around the lollipop trees in the courtyard. They were all over the place. Well, I don't know if it was mating season or what, but every tree had so many moths that the trees were covered with them. Well, I told Dwayne, "Yep, something's wrong. Something's gonna happen." Again, he told me to shut up. We got to King Street, and no matter what time of the night it is always lighted well. When we got to this point, I thought we were safe, but as we walked across King Street right in front of McKinley High School, I noticed this guy walking in front of us. He was walking on the sidewalk from our right side, and he was going to the left, And as I looked at this guy, he had his head down, and I kept staring at him because he had something white on his lip. I couldn't for the life of me figure out what it was. He was well dressed in slacks and a coat, and for some reason, unknown to me, my eyes couldn't totally focus on this person. I could see him, but just slightly blurry for some weird reason. The guy kept walking, and I kept looking at him and at that white thing on his upper lip. What is that? I thought. I really wanted to know. As soon as he made his way right in front of me, he looked directly at me, and I've never been so scared in all my life. I wanted to run, but I didn't want this thing coming after me. What I saw was this guy looking at me directly in the eyes, and I saw wild hair everywhere, even on his cheeks and jaws. He opened his mouth slightly. That white thing on his upper lip, what turns out he had two of them sticking out from the bottom of his jaw. It was fangs coming out of his mouth, and they were protruding onto his upper lip. I thought I was going to die right then and there as he looked at me. He also had small black pupils in his eyes, and there was no white in the eyes at all. It was mainly yellow. We tried to show no fear, and we just walked normally. The creature turned his head and kept walking. Then I asked Dwayne, "Did you see what I saw?" He told me, "I don't know what I saw." Well, I asked him, "Did it have wild hair, fangs, and yellow eyes?" "That's what I saw," he said. "That's exactly what I saw." We were sure this thing was gone, so I told Dwayne, "Let's get the hell out of here," and we ran all the way to Burger King. We were scared, but there were many logical explanations as to what happened at this point. Many people have told me it could have been someone wearing a mask. He could have just been a bum. All are valid points, but none of the explanations could explain what happened next. I called my mother on the phone, because I was supposed to, and I was supposed to have been home by now, and I was too scared to go home. I wanted to stay with my friend Dwayne at his house for the night, and then go home during the daylight. I tried to tell my mother what we saw, and she yelled at me, calling me names and telling me that I needed to get home. But I feared for my life, and there was no way in hell I was going to go home now by myself. So we stood in Burger King until it closed, looking at the full moon outside. Dwayne's house was close, and that's where I spent the night. At midnight or so, we were upstairs in his room talking, when all of a sudden you could hear dogs howling from far away. Then more dogs started howling. Well, I didn't know there were that many dogs in the neighborhood. There must have been 5 or 6 started to howl, and you could tell some of them were far away. Some would howl from one direction and then another. And I asked Dwayne, "What's the matter with the dogs in your neighborhood?" He said, "I don't know, Danny. This is the first time I've heard dogs howling like this." Then we could hear something running around in my friend's yard. It was growling, and I told my friend Dwayne that it's downstairs. We're going to die. I don't remember how long this thing was downstairs running around, but it seemed like an eternity. Somehow we made it until the morning, and we were both alive and still in one piece. My friend went to his Buddhist church to pray, and I went home thinking all was well once daylight came. Dwayne was a Buddhist, and I really didn't want to go with him to pray. That night at 8 p.m., when no one was home but me in Kahili, where I was living at the time, I stood there in fear as I could hear the dogs start to howl in my neighborhood. First you could hear one dog from far away in certain directions, and then other dogs closer and closer. And then something started running around my yard, growling at my window where I was sitting right next to. I called Dwayne and I told him, "This is going to be my last night alive. I know this thing's going to kill me." Well, this continued on at my house for 2 weeks every night after seeing this creature. I was always horrified during that time, and I wasn't sure if that night would be the night that it caught me. Dwayne, till this day, has never told anyone of this encounter and seeing such a thing. I swear to this day I still feel creepy walking around in the dark. Do werewolves exist? I don't really know, to be honest, but this thing sure as hell looked like one to me. And I pray all the time that I just never see such a thing again. And if you ask me if I believe in werewolves, all my life I thought it was just something in the movies, but now I'm not so sure. I swear on my life that this happened to me. I know some might think I'm crazy, and some might think I saw something else. I don't know what to say, except if you ask me if I'm scared of the dark, I'll tell you I am. And he says, thank you for your time. Okay, Danny is the author of this, and I have a feeling, I don't know for sure, but I think this is from a young writer, and it's probably fiction. I don't know. Maybe there was this is a PDF file, and I just downloaded it, put it in my queued folder of stories to read. And so I don't know if this is fiction or not, but it sounds like a young person wrote this. But I thought it was a good story. I mean, and if it was a young person who wrote this, you did an exceptional job writing. And if there's other young people out there who'd like to write strange, scary, or odd stories, send them to me. I used to do that all the time with young kids. They would send us stories with the permission of your parents, of course. I don't want anybody any adolescents under the adult age of, let's say, 18, sending me a story to read without getting your parents' blessing. I don't know that that's a big deal, but I'm kind of stickler for that. I would never want my daughter sending stuff in and some strange guy reading their story. So make sure you get your parents' permission. Let them know you're sending someone you don't know an email. And let them listen to the podcast and make sure they feel comfortable with it. But all that said, if there are any young people out there who'd like to write, parents listening, you might want to encourage your kids to send in a story. And when you do, just, say I don't know, put fiction. I don't know. I'll find it. I mean, I'll eventually find it. And so anyway, send those to me. I'll quit yakking on about it. But this was a really good story, Danny. I appreciate you sending it. All right, here's an email, and I'm going to say up front that this was signed by Anthony, Ronnie, Vinny, Tommy, T4, and CJ. I thought that was good. I think they collaborated and someone wrote this story, but it's a pretty good one, so hang on to your weaves. But here's what they write. In my family, the men have a tradition of heading up to Parker Dam State Park on Thanksgiving night and renting a cabin for a week of hunting. Rifle season always begins right after Thanksgiving, and we like to be there on opening day. One year, we all headed up as usual, knowing that the season would begin on Monday, and that we had the weekend to have fun. We planned to spend the weekend hiking in the woods and finding new areas to hunt during the day, and at night, we figured we'd all pile into our trucks and do some spotlighting. It's illegal, man. For some people, that means illegal hunting, but for us, it meant that we just wanted to see what kinds of animals are out there. Deer, bears, coyotes, whatever we could spot. Still illegal, dude. You cannot shine lights to look for wildlife. At least you can't in Mississippi. Anyway, we're all believers in Sasquatch, and it doesn't mean everything we see or hear is automatically a Bigfoot, but it does mean that we're aware, and there's more in the woods than the local forest ranger might be willing to admit. And being out there at night, there's always that hope that we just might see one cross the road in front of us. After we got all settled in on the first night, we decided to head out on a night hike down the road to a little turnaround we call the Loop. To make things more interesting, we didn't take our flashlights. We were a bunch of grown men, and what do we have to be afraid of, right? Besides, it's a lot easier to scare the younger members of our group when everything is dark. I said we were grown men, and that doesn't mean we were acting like them. The road was dark and eerie, as we expected it to be, and as we walked along, we took turns psyching each other out with stories designed to raise the hackles on our necks, mixed with occasional jump scares. It was all good for a laugh, and the older members of our group were especially relentless on the younger, less experienced ones. I don't know when or if things got quiet around us. we were making enough noise to chase most of the wildlife away and having too much fun in the process. There was only one member of our party who wasn't exactly enjoying himself. The jump scares were starting to get to him. He kept telling us to cut it out and to knock it off. Finally, we told him it was all in fun and he was completely safe with us. And as if on cue, the second words were out of our mouths and a loud whoop rang out from the hillside behind us. Well, I've hunted all my life, but that was something I had never heard before. The sound was unsettling enough, but the volume and the projection was downright startling. No human has that kind of lung capacity. There was a brief second when everyone stopped and stared wide-eyed at each other before we broke and ran hell-bent for leather back to the cabin. We almost left the young man we had just tried to convince that he was nothing to be afraid of standing in the road by himself, and back inside we talked about what that sound could have been. No one seemed to recognize it. No one was able to offer any good suggestions for what it might have been. It was a question that was still unanswered as we all crawled into our beds to get some sleep. That night was a cold one. The temperatures dropped down into the teens. It was the kind of night that you hoped your bladder would survive because there was no way anyone would crawl out of his bed to head to the bathroom. After a few more minutes of conversation about the whoop, we all somehow managed to fall asleep. At 4 a.m., something slapped the side of the cabin. I sat straight up and I looked around at everyone else who were all doing the same. We were all accounted for. No one had slipped outside to play a prank on us. Who in their right mind would have done that? It was freezing out there. Besides, the sound was so loud and heavy, and I don't think any of us would have had the strength to have hit the cabin that hard. When the sun came up that morning, we walked around the cabin to see if a branch might have fallen on it, and the woods on the backside came almost up to the cabin. Just inside the tree line, we found a huge pile of scat. It didn't look like typical animal scat, and it didn't match any of the animals we knew to be in the area. It looked more like something a human would produce. Thankfully, the rest of the day was uneventful. Monday came, and we'd pretty much forgotten about the events of that first night and were ready to hunt. My spot was deep into the woods. There was a long walk through thick forest to a remote spot where I wasn't likely to see anyone else. Unfortunately, I didn't see any deer that day either. The sun was setting when I decided it was time to pack it in for the day, and as soon as I started gathering up my gear, I began to hear a strange humming sound coming from behind me, deep in the thick pine laurel. It was almost like a vibration running through me. Well, nervously, I began to make my way back to camp, and as soon as I started moving, I felt the sensation of being watched and followed, and that humming didn't stop. Time creeped by, and my senses were on edge. Every twig snap, every leaf rustle built on the tension I was feeling. Each step I took was another step closer to the cabin, but it didn't feel like a step away from danger. Finally, I reached the small creek that separated my hunting area from the main trail back to camp, and as I crossed over it, I stopped. No more humming, no more being watched, no more feeling of being followed. It was as if I had crossed a boundary line that whatever was out there couldn't cross. Well, I made the final leg of the hike feeling relieved. We didn't actually see any Sasquatch on that trip, so maybe this isn't the most interesting or scary encounter to hear about, but it was enough to keep us spooked, and I've since done some research on Parker Dam. It has a history of documented sightings and Sasquatch encounters. Recently, we purchased our own cabin just up the road from where this all took place. It'll be interesting to see what happens on future hunting trips. Oh man, that was a good story. You didn't see it, but you got almost every other sensory experience that people usually talk about with Bigfoot. I don't know where Parker Dam state park is. I don't know what state this man is in. I could look it up, but I'm too lazy. If it's that cold around Thanksgiving, it's probably up north somewhere. Anyway, to Anthony, Ronnie, Vinny, Tommy, T4, and CJ, thanks for the story. It was really good, and I hope the audience enjoyed it. I sure did. I'm going to wind up this podcast with a piece of horror fiction called The Folding Man. It was written by author Austin Mooney. Austin is a good writer. I love his imagination and his original stories. I found him on a website called Reedsy, Reedsy. He has a few stories published there, and I asked him if I could narrate these stories on the podcast, and he graciously said yes. This is one of two of the last stories that were on the original What If It's True YouTube channel, which is now the Steve Lilly Journals channel, that I'm moving over to Dixie Cryptid. Anyway, it's a good story. I hope you guys enjoy it, and I hope you enjoy Austin's imagination. The Folding Man by Austin Mooney. Low howling rattled the wall that Abby shared with her neighbor Lewis. It was enough to break her concentration. Abby was an avid runner doing some light stretching before venturing out into the city for a few miles of uninterrupted physical exertion. She had only just begun her trance, closed her eyes and let her forehead rest on her kneecap to complete a head-to-knee stretch, warming and smoothing the muscles of her strong legs, falling silently into a serene mental state that fueled her jogs when the cries shook her loose and commanded her attention. Lewis had lived in the building for over 10 years, 3 of which had been spent next to Abby. He was a generation older than her, and he frequently complained about other neighbors and the previous occupants of her apartment. His gripes were typically trivial, and she had gathered over time that they were nothing more than conversation fodder. Lewis had lived alone for so long that he found it difficult to connect with others without searching for a common enemy. The screaming became more pronounced as Abby stood up and moved toward her door. It was clearly the result of great physical pain. She stood quietly by her door, ear aimed at the hallway, waiting for a sign to interject. It wasn't unlike Lewis, who worked from home, to angrily carry out a domestic task by letting everyone in the building know his discomfort. But this time was different. He indeed sounded like he needed help, and then he called out for it. Abby opened her door, her running shoes already equipped, and hurried to Lewis's door. "Lewis," she said, "are you okay?" "Abby," he said, his voice muffled, "please come inside. I need help. I don't know how it happened." Abby tried to open his door but found it tightly sealed. The doorknob defiantly held its place in her hand. "It's locked," she said. "Oh, God," Lewis cried, his voice muffled by more than just the wooden door between them. Something sounded like it was covering his face. A rolling storm of uncoordinated crashing and pained moaning from inside Lewis' apartment shuttered the hallway around Abby. She heard him drag and shuffle his weight toward her, and the lock clicked and she opened the door. Although the scene within the humble apartment contained familiar images, their presentation was bizarre and terribly foreign enough to shock Abby. She gasped and let go of the door, which then closed itself in her face. She promptly opened it again, desperately wishing to consume more than visual information, and fully entered the apartment. Lewis was bending his body at the waist so that his forehead was touching his knee. His face was obscured, pointing behind him through his legs. His hips looked overexerted and knotted, and the young woman winced at the sight of them. He was breathing heavily and wobbling back and forth. "What's going on?" She regained her breath. "I'm folding up," Lewis said. "I'm folding all the way up. I can't bend back. I can't." My skull is going to fuse with my knees. I knew this would happen. I saw it. I saw a story about it on the news. An Asian guy, his spine went all nuts and he folded in half and his face fused with his knees. And his mom had to take care of him for decades until he got surgery. I don't have a mom to take care of me, Abby. I can't. Lewis's stiff and teetering legs finally lost balance, and Abby caught him before he fell forward, which would have caused immeasurable agony and exacerbated his predicament. She gently laid him in a sitting position with his face pointed toward the floor in a knee-to-head stretch. You can't sit up? It took all of my strength to even stand myself up so I could waddle over to the door. No, I can't straighten my back. I'm folding. Oh, God, Abby, I'm folding. Abby knew better than to attempt fixing whatever was happening with his spine. She could make it worse. Briefly, she imagined everything she was saying to be in his mind. Perhaps he had become paranoid after seeing the rare condition on the news, and he brought it upon himself in some kind of psychosomatic response. However, his panic convinced her that he had no control over his body, or at the very least his mind wouldn't allow it. Should I call an ambulance? I did. They didn't believe me. Can you believe that? He said. What the hell do we even have ambulances for in this town if they don't do anything? So they just get to pick up who they're going to help now? Wish someone would have told me that. They're not coming? They'll probably come. I don't know. I hung up when they didn't believe me because they were pissing me off. What did they say they were coming? I gave them my address. Okay, I'll wait with you until the ambulance gets here. Is there anything I can do? Can I get you anything? She asked. Yeah, hand me the mirror on the table. Abby took a small handheld mirror from the counter and handed it down to Lewis. He positioned it beneath his legs and angled it so that he could make eye contact with her, and she was able to see his face. She could only see his eyes. His forehead was obscured, and it was pressed against his knee as though it were gripped to it by a cult of ghosts. Hey, there he is, she smiled. Abby, I'm so sorry I brought you into this. I know the reason I got the condition is because I heard about it, and that's probably how it'll spread to you. When we get to the hospital, you should have them check you out. I don't even know what they could do, but you'll get it like I did. I know you will. You must get on top of it quickly. You've seen it. Oh, no, you love to run. God, you were about to run. I'm so sorry. I've ruined it for you. It's okay, Lewis. I'm okay. Let's just worry about you. I need you to bring me something else, he said. What is it? Lewis closed his eyes and gulped deeply. He took a few shallow breaths and appeared to decide against whatever he was going to say. His inner argument fluttered behind his eyes, and he looked down at the floor in front of him and then darted his eyes toward the mirror and reflected them at Abby with shrill brilliance. Grab the hammer that's in my toolbox in the hallway closet, and then grab the kitchen knife and the knife block on the counter. Bring them to me. Abby ran to the hallway closet, which sat across from Lewis's office. Once she found the hammer and turned to re-enter the kitchen, she noticed his computer through a slightly cracked door. On its screen brightly beamed an article focusing on the tragedy of a folding man who had developed a rare disorder that caused his body to fold in on itself. Near the bottom of the screen were photos of many different people who suffered from the condition. It seemed to have affected the entire town where the original case appeared. Abby, Lewis called. She straightened up, and she left the office door and returned to the kitchen, where she grabbed the knife Lewis had requested. What do you need to do? She asked. It's what you need to do, he said. She paused. What? I can't do this myself. My skull is fusing to my knee bone. By the time the ambulance gets here, it'll be far too gone. It's just getting harder and harder to break them apart with each passing minute. Soon the bond will be so strong that they'll have to remove an entire section of my skull. I'll have brain damage. They might have to amputate my leg. If you can pry them apart now before they set, I might be able to continue getting up and down these goddamn stairs in this godforsaken building. I need you to put the tip of that knife blade on the spot where my skull is fusing to my knee and hit it with the hammer." She took a moment to process this information. The knife and the hammer felt heavy in her hands. Abby had never counted herself as someone who could perform such a gruesome act. To clobber a crude cooking utensil through the neighbor's bones would be perhaps the most challenging and heart-pounding activity she could carry out. Her jog would evaporate behind her and feel untraceable for the next few days. Any further action beyond this moment would surely end in a heart attack. "I don't know if I can do that, Lewis," she said. "I can't do it. You've got to do it. Otherwise, they'll never separate. They'll never unfold me." "Okay." She paused and breathed, allowing a brief meditation to cool her nerves. "I need you to guide me through it." Lewis directed Abby with the tenderness and understanding of someone trusting their life to a stranger. He desperately wanted her to succeed in her task, and the only way to truly encourage her was to show her that he would forgive her even if she happened to mistakenly drive the knife through his brain. Throngs of steel could push through this melting, pulsing mind, and it would be a relief from the terror of this folding. The modest blade's tip clumsily settled upon the very center of the connection between Lewis's forehead and his kneecap. She held the handle square and loaded her grip on the hammer. Both of them sat quietly to ready their minds for the unveiling of their fate and come to peace with each conceivable outcome. And Lewis closed his eyes. "Do it." Abby intended to strike the handle with much more force than what transpired, but she lost her spirit when the moment came. Instead of a clean break, the knife became lodged between Lewis's face and his leg. It sat there stuck, blood softly beginning to trickle along its edge, and he opened his eyes, and then he screamed. He yelled at her to strike it again, but she froze. Her mind pleaded with her to run away, to escape back down the hall and take shelter safely in her apartment. Her flight response had been initiated, and she was working against every fiber of her instinctual programming to flee. What was she doing? She wasn't a doctor. She shouldn't be hammering a knife into a man's head. She couldn't do it. While she mulled over her misfortune, Lewis's cries reached a fever pitch, and again she was pulled from her trance into a clear decision. She pulled back the hammer and struck the kitchen knife as hard as her strength would allow. There was a pop, and Lewis turned his head, laughing. "You did it!" he smiled. A hole bursting with exposed skull rained blood over his eyes. A patch of flesh that had formed between the opposing sections of body ripped away, and fresh air leaked into Lewis's tissue. He cackled until the red mess was completely covering his mouth. Abby searched the kitchen drawers for fresh towels. Only a short moment in doing this chore felt like an eternity, and she excitedly turned back to her poor neighbor once it was completed. However, Abby was met with a horrifying vision that left those clean towels on the floor beside her feet. Lewis retched and gargled and moaned and released a resounding screech. His bones gnarled and twisted and cracked. Like twigs breaking in the hands of a child, his body began to fold again. He had become like a piece of paper, now creased in half twice. The middle of his spine and his thighs split and whipped around another 180-degree fold. and hot blood gushed from his face like pressure escaping a deflating air mattress or a balloon full of watercolors placed beneath the guillotine. They both screamed, and through the willow wall of the gory turmoil emerged the light song of the door buzzer. The ambulance had arrived. There was no time to move with uncertainty. The medical professionals who ultimately saved Lewis, or they would have been standing in the apartment for hours. Although none of them had seen this condition before, some of them had heard about it, and their decision to stay and help was weighed very carefully against those stories. Fortunately, nobody seemed concerned about why Abby was clenching a bloody hammer and standing over a knife because she would have needed to explain herself, which she was entirely incapable of doing. Instead, Lewis explained as much as he could before his energy level reflected the amount of blood he had lost. And soon, the ambulance was gone, and Abby was back in her apartment, washing the crusty, dark crimson off her hands. Lewis underwent a series of complex and painful surgeries. Essentially, doctors had to break most of his bones to set them back correctly, his entire body broken. Luckily, he had made it to the emergency room in time. He would recount later that the doctors told him if they had waited any longer, his head would have permanently fused to his knee, and they would have been unable to disconnect it without causing considerable brain damage. Coincidentally, another patient in the hospital had developed an identical host of symptoms while being monitored for an unrelated medical condition and tragically passed away without ever knowing exactly what was happening to them. Health staff on the site were able to make observations during the chaos that assisted in Lewis's rapid recovery when he arrived only moments later. 2 in one night. They couldn't believe it. Despite being in physical rehab over the following weeks, Lewis would send messages to Abby asking how she was feeling, and she would politely reply, "Worry about yourself." She put her phone down and resumed stretching for her run. The sun and nirvana of chemicals coursing through her body would soon be giving her a momentary reprieve from the stress of her recent existence. She bent forward and held her breath as she brushed her nose against the stubble of her leg hair in a head-to-knee stretch. And then she sat up and smiled. Thanks for listening. I appreciate it as always. Maybe you could hit the like button or thumbs up button or leave a review if you're listening on the podcast on a podcast app. I would certainly appreciate it. And come back and listen to the next podcast. I hope it's good enough that you want to come back. Otherwise, Happy New Year to everyone, and we'll see you on the next one. Love you all. Thank you.